When we were kids, and we've all played this, that we know how to do this, called the telephone game. That's where you whisper something in somebody's ear and they whisper it down the line and it finally gets to the end and it's all convoluted. Okay. That's the way some people view tradition. They see tradition as that which is passed along and slightly obliterated with each passing and morphed and changed until at the end it doesn't mean anything. Uh, and so tradition in this case is very confusing. There are others that view tradition as that which is stifling and boring, and they want nothing to do with it because it has nothing to do with the modern world and where we're at today in our existential situation. And then there's Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof, for whom tradition was a living, breathing thing. And it was important not just to maintain the tradition, but to live into it. In Judaism, the tradition is um, the revelation. And I say this because when you go to the Jewish uh, the I started to use the word canon. I don't want to use that word. Um, the important books of rabbinic Judaism, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Sifra, and the Talmud, and then of course the Midrash, which is voluminous. When you go particularly from Mishnah, Tosefta, and Talmud, you're looking at a collection of traditions. And starting with the Mishnah, you have collections of rabbinic thought, the different rabbis thinking different things on different topics and subjects, and it's a rather remarkable book. Because in this collection of texts about little laws and the proper way to do a sacrifice in the temple, even though there's no temple, um, all these things they're doing, you're always going to get Rabbi A says this, Rabbi B says that, and Rabbi C comes along and says this, and they've all got their scriptures they're using. But the point I'm trying to make, and this is really true when you get to Tosefta, and then when you get to Talmud, it's magnified because you have not just the Amoraic and the Tannaitic rabbis, but now you've got uh, the later rabbis of the fifth and sixth centuries that are fourth and fifth centuries that are now part of the tradition. In all these cases, the Jews never had a problem saying, we disagree on reading this text. We have this way of looking at it. This rabbi says this rabbi comes along and says, yeah, but this word that's used over here was also used here and it means that there, so it must mean this here. And now we have a reading that ameliorates the two, and on and on. Christianity's failure is its utter inability to recognize that the Bible is a debate, and it invites us into that debate. We are like the rabbis engaging these other rabbis. That is, the Bible is part of the tradition, and we are going to interpret it, which means we are going to re-tradition the tradition. And we're going to come back to that term, retraditioning, which comes from the Anabaptist thinker John Howard Yoder. But before we do, I want to note there's a difference between tradition and traditionalism. The 20th century church historian out of Yale, Yaroslav Pelikan, wrote a book on not only John Henry Newman, but a book on tradition. And in this, he says, tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. Okay. So when I talk about tradition, I want to talk about it in the same way Tevye does. It's a living, breathing thing. And we are part of that. We are part of that because we engage it and we retradition it. We cannot get away from tradition. This is something that Protestants uh, don't understand. And part of the reason they don't understand it is because of the way Luther had to react to the notion of tradition in his time. There were two major Augustinian schools of thought leading into the Reformation and two different views of tradition leading into the Reformation, and Luther chose one over the other. The Roman Catholics chose the one where tradition and the Bible are on the same level, but they're both interpreted by the bishops. The bishops have the authority to interpret, whereas for Luther's Augustinian model, the tradition could be critiqued by the scripture. So this, again, we go back to the Reformation to see this, but the inability of the Protestant tradition to engage with tradition is a very sad thing, and I'm really, it's very frustrating for me to see the way that certain theological influencers they want to promote just parts of the tradition, like I won't mention names, but there's a very famous Roman Catholic priest who loves to talk about the mystics. The mystics say this. The mystics said. I'm thinking to myself, I got the library mystics down in my basement. I've read them all. I've enjoyed them. I've learned from them. I've benefited from them. But they are not the be all and end all because most of the time they're engaging in some form of allegory. And I just can't read it, the biblical text that way. Like I said, I'm not an allegorist. I know others are, and I don't find much of that way successful. But at any rate, let me carry on. The tradition of the church. The first time that there is going to be a tradition recognized in the church is when the second century fathers began to talk about apostolic succession. You have to use your imagination here, friends. You not only have to imagine what it's like for Jewish missionaries to go into Greco-Roman society, make converts not just of Jews, but also of God-fearers in the synagogues, and then later just pure Gentiles. And then, after the destruction of the temple and the almost silencing of Jewish Christianity because they've fled east, they're not going their writings are not going to be read in either the Eastern Church or the Western Church. They're a division apart. Um, After that, you've got to imagine cities as in churches as they're going from generation to generation. And again, they are looking for the story that's authentic. One of the beautiful things about the second century and third century, the amazing thing, is the production of documents that we would call the Apocryphal New Testament. The stories about Jesus that got made up are rather remarkable, and so um, Jesus gets in an argument with a little boy and turns him into stone. And the little boy's mother has to go begging Mother Mary, please tell Jesus turn him back into my little boy again. You just got these imagination run wild things, but you've also got Gnosticism and you've got all kinds of Gnosticism. Gnosticism's not a thing, it is a multifaceted reality. There are different types of Gnostics out there, and that is really infiltrating the church in the second century. And you have the arguments with Judaism about the Septuagint. To whom do the Jewish scriptures belong, even in Greek translation? Do they belong to the Jews or do they belong to the Christians? Okay, so the second century, these house churches, as they're emerging, they're looking for authority, and the authority that they begin to go to, particularly what we call the great Sees, Sees, the great bishoprics, Alexandria, Rome, Jerusalem, Caesarea, Corinth, Ephesus, these places now begin to do things like, oh, I knew Henry who knew the Apostle Paul. Oh, I knew Sarah who knew the Apostle John. And you start developing apostolic succession. Okay. So, I mean, I've even pulled that a couple of times on people that I think misrepresent Bonhoeffer. I've said I knew over 15 of his friends and family. I mean, I spent time with them, talked with them. I feel like I have a knowledge of Dietrich that's going to be very, very different from someone who just reads books. You know, there is something about that living voice, about knowing somebody and what they're like and what they said. Um, and it's the same thing, for example, with Girard. I knew him for a quarter century. I was his friend. Read his stuff. He read mine, and happy, happy. And when someone comes along and says Girard would say this, I just got to stand up and go, no, 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 no. That's just you just don't know Rene. That's not what he would say. Well, the same thing's going on in the early church. It's very important. If someone comes along and says, when Christ died, the Holy Spirit, the divine part of Christ, left him because divinity can't suffer, divinity can't die. So divinity had to leave Jesus, and only the human Jesus died. That's that's not gospel. That is not gospel at all. And what's even worse is that some manuscripts have the Spirit, the divine Christ, leaving the human Jesus and laughing, mocking that the human Jesus is dying. That's not the Christian faith. And neither is most Gnostic speculation that we're given in the Gnostic text that we've discovered in Nag Hammadi. So the bishops had to deal with this. What was the Christian faith? What was it that is passed on from Paul and the apostles to the sub-apostolic period, to thinkers like Ignatius or Papias or Polycarp? What was this tradition? What was it? And so it's in Eusebius that we begin to have the fathers as the tradition. And it's in Eusebius that we have the first, earliest succession lists of bishops of a particular of the major sees. These bishop lists. First was this one, then this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. Now we have our time. Okay. These succession lists create the concept of apostolic authority. That's apostolic authorities in the bishops. It's not in the text, it's in the bishops. Okay. And this notion of tradition is not simply what is believed, but it's very clear cut. This tradition that the church insists that one clings to will make its way from a baptismal creed to a formal hermeneutic known as the regula fidei, the rule of faith, and then into the creed, the great creed that we know as the Nicene Creed. This is the Trinitarian formula. I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, one God forever. Amen. This formula is the hermeneutic lens that the early writers insist have to be used in order to discern the gospel. This is why all the debates for 4 friggin' centuries were about the relationship of the Father to the Son, and then eventually about the divine and the human in Jesus. They would go battle that up. But for the first 4 centuries, it was all about the relationship of the Father to the Son. Who was this one called Father? Because as Marcion had already seen, Father is very different from God in the Jewish scriptures. And the early church is going to wrestle with this. I think they're going to wrestle with it and lose, I think Marcion's question is correct. Marcion's answer is wrong, but the early church's answer is just as wrong. But I have other lectures on this. You can go look in the Discipleship for Today group. Look up the lecture on Marcion, and that's all there. Um, what is the impulse of the Christian tradition? The impulse of the Christian tradition has been and always will be, what is the relationship of Jesus of Nazareth to the creator of the universe? That is the question. It is absolutely the question. And for those of us that insist that that relationship, um, uh, oh God, I hate to use the word ontological. I'm going to use the relationship is essential. Okay. The Father is revealed completely in the Son. The Son completely reveals the Father. That the only difference between them, as Athanasius would say, is the appellate's Father and Son. That's the only difference. This connection is going to be very, very key, not just in the early church, but in our own time for discerning the gospel again. In today's world, my friends, we have seen the almost virtual dissolution of the relationship between the Father and the Son in Enlightenment liberal Protestantism from Schleiermacher forward. Okay. I have, again, I have always been a progressive Christian, but I have very many progressive Christian friends for whom Jesus is neither the Son of the Father, nor for whom he's been raised from the dead. He's just a good guy. He's a social prophet. Whatever. He's a human being, but he's not. He is not God. He's not to be considered as divine. And I frankly find that to be disturbing. But I find just as disturbing the identification of the violent God with Jesus and turning Jesus into a violent human being and a complete misreading of the Gospels and actually a bad reading of the Hebrew Scriptures. Ancient Gnostics would divorce Jesus' humanity from his divinity, and that's the identical thing that is being done today within parts of the Protestant tradition. It's just the opposite. The one valorizes his divinity in the early church, and the today we valorize his humanity. Part of this is because we don't even know what being a human being is. Our definition of person is still trapped within the subject faculty viewpoint rather than the interrelational, interpersonal. And so if we're locked into that older philosophical model, we're gonna absolutely either have a divine or a human Jesus, but we aren't going to be able to see the connection between the two. The story in the Bible is the story of the Son, and the context of that story is the story of the Father's relationship to Israel. I'm going to say that again. The story of the Bible is the story of the Son. The context of that story is the story of the Father's relationship to Israel in the revelation process. And the meta narrative of all of this, Old Testament, New Testament, is this story's, the canon, the Bible's relationship to the way the world constructs its relationship to divinity. That is, its theology. And the world does theology, friends, all the time. Always did. Going back to the early, you could go back to the early philosophers, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Heraclitus. They did theology. They thought about the gods. And the Bible, and we've continued this all through civilization. If you were in the last seminar, we did the whole religion revelation thing, so you know what I'm talking about. And I'm building on that piece now. We are those who have this story, this tradition, this father-son relationship that we are telling everyone about. But we've got to learn to tell it within the framework that it's given us in the biblical tradition and the church. It's very, very important. I despise forms of the church, certain forms. I despise institutional forms. I despise uh, dead forms. I despise churches that are totalitarian in their thinking. That's not church to me. That's not even Christianity. I can't darken the doors of those churches. I wouldn't go if I was invited to preach. I can say that there are churches, not necessarily denominations, but churches that do take the tradition seriously. They do want to think theologically. They do want to learn how they can become part of this great story that's being told. It's not finished. It might start in Genesis, but it's not finished. We're part of that story. We're part of that narrative. And our children will be, and our grandchildren will be. Maybe we'll get lucky and AI will be too. I don't know. I have my concerns about that. All right. Retradition. Does the Bible engage in it? You betcha it does. We've done this before. We'll do it again very briefly. First of all, you have oral tradition long before text. You have oral tradition. There is Torah as orality, as oral law before Torah starts being written down. David, who lives sometime around the year 1000, 10 to 970s when he reigns, he already loves the law of the Lord. He can say this, I love the law of the Lord. He's not referring to the written Torah. He's referring to the law that's still being passed on by the priestly tradition that has the tabernacle. Okay? And that law is not going to get written down. And when it does, it gets written down in chunks by different communities, scribal communities. It used to be that we talked about the writers of the Torah, the documentary hypothesis, the four writers, JEDP. Okay. We don't want to think that way. What we want to think in terms of our scribal communities. Scribal communities it's not about an author or some one person deciding this, writing this text out. It's about communities early on that begin writing and copying, editing and passing on these narrative stories in Torah. Okay, there's an important book. Where is it? Oh, I brought it in here. Here it is. It's an important new book by William Schneidevend called Who Really Wrote the Bible? And he deals in some detail with ancient Hebrew scribal communities. And there are others, by the way, that have done some great work on Christian scribal communities in the third, fourth, fifth, sixth centuries on through the illuminated manuscripts of the Middle Ages. But these scribal communities would begin to gather local traditions, okay? For the first local tradition is going to be the writer that's known as I'll say Yahwist, comes from the YHWH, Hashem, the name. Okay. So this Yahwist is this first community that begins writing their version of events in Torah. For example, the second creation story in the book of Genesis is the Yahwist, the one that kind of crunches down in a few verses the whole of chapter, what we know as chapter one, that particular narrative frame that's not he doesn't have access to, but they crunch it down and mix. The days are different in both narratives, if you notice, and you've got the garden and God makes the woman, and then they have the snake, and on and on and on. That's the Yahwist. That writer begins writing sometime after David's death. and the temple being built. And it's during this time that the Elohist, the E writer, begins writing his version of things. He would have most likely um, uh, also been a priest. All of these would have been priests, but this one is now in the north and gathering northern traditions. Then, sometime between 600 and 500, the priestly writer comes along and does the editing of Genesis through Numbers. And the southern exile occurs in 587, but before that, in 620, under the reign of King Josiah, a scribal community took Exodus and Numbers and worked hard to reconcile the contradictory tithing laws in these books and framed the book of Deuteronomy. And that's known as the Deuteronomist, who also then, that community has a hand in the rewriting of the text. The text is not inviolate yet, my friends. Okay, there's going to be other versions of Torah. The Samaritan version of Torah in the north is going to be different than the southern version of Torah in Judea in many instances. The point of all this is that already within Torah, there is a process of retraditioning traditions. And we see this especially with the way and the editor puts together the Noah story. And if you go through the Noah story and you color code the Yahwist and the Elohist and the priestly writer, you can see how this writer has taken these two quite distinct narratives about the flood and brought them together. We also see this retraditioning in the book of Job. The chapters 3 through 37 are an extended lament about the condition of a person who was once in great favor, probably a king, and has now been dethroned and cast to the bottom and has become the scapegoat of the scapegoats. He's at the ultimate bottom. And that will later get framed in early Second Temple Judaism with a prologue and an epilogue. A prologue, which has an angel walking around that functions like Rudy Giuliani and is the prosecutor and points out Job, and that's why he's got all these woes. God let it happen. And then at the end of the book, of course, we've got God berating Job, like, where were you when I created everything? Quit your bitching. Um, and that's a very different reading of what's actually going on in that scapegoating process in the book of Job, much like Psalm 73. Isaiah has a school. Not that he's the leader of a school like a dean or anything, but he obviously was influential enough that his students would come along and rewrite his tradition. And then a third generation would too. And that's why when scholars go to the book of Isaiah, they can talk about first Isaiah 1 through 39, second Isaiah 40 through 55, third Isaiah 56 through 66. These are different schools of thought, but their common connection is this prophet and his prophecies. Manuscript traditions and scribal communities continued to rewrite texts. You can go to 2 Peter chapter 2 and find the Epistle of Jude virtually embedded there, minus the things that would create issues, like citations from the Assumption of Moses in 1st Enoch. But it's embedded there. Chunks of Ephesians are embedded in Colossians or vice versa by the Apostle Paul. The synoptic writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all have a literary relationship. However you want to conceive of it, they are using each other's texts. My preference is Mark in priority, then Matthew, midrashing on Mark, and then Luke using Mark and the Hebrew gospel to correct Matthew. That's my view. There are many other views, and you're welcome to take whatever you want. But the point is, scholarship recognizes that Mark is reappropriated by at least Matthew and Luke. Okay? So this retraditioning, this use of the tradition is already occurring within the biblical tradition itself. And at the end of the first century, the oral and written traditions are not set. There is still both happening. 2 generations past the death of Jesus, the oral tradition is still strong. It's really at this time, at the beginning of the second century, that we notice the emergence of one book in particular throughout the Christian world that will have more significance than any other book, and that's the Gospel of Matthew. Now, the Gospel of Matthew is, again, debatably, everything's debatable, but located in Antioch, Syria, along with, in the general region, the Didache, and then in the early second century, of course, the Bishop of Antioch, Ignatius, and his 7 authentic letters. Ignatius is already recognizing Paul and his letters as an authority in the teens of the second century. But the tradition of Paul is being challenged on 2 major fronts. One front is Marcion. Marcion has collected the authentic letters of Paul, not including the pastorals, because they're not written yet, because they're going to be written at this time against Marcion. The book of Acts is going to be written at this time against Marcion. Probably the same writer that wrote the gospel some 30 years previous. But the point is that here, Paul's memory, who is Paul, the issue is who's got the right tradition. Marcion claims a certain way of reading Paul. That's his tradition. The writer of the pastorals is going to come along and claim a much more conservative Paul, because that writer is also going to be writing, this is why it's so patriarchal, he's going to be writing against the traditions, the stories that can be found in a really, really important second century book, the Acts of Paul and Thecla. In the Acts of Paul and Thecla, Paul ordains women, recognizes them as apostles. He's recognizes a charismatic authority. There is no patriarchy in the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And there is a good argument to be made that that is a more accurate understanding of who Paul was, rather than the patriarchal Paul that's found in the pastoral letters. And there's a scholar, honest to God, his name is Ronald McDonald. That's his name. He's written a fantastic book on this, on Paul the Apostle and the Legend. And I think it's very important. I think it's also important, Joseph Tyson's thesis in his book on the book of Acts, that Acts is written at this time to deal with a portrait of Paul. Marcion wants to cut Paul off from Judaism entirely, right? And what does Acts do? It says, no, 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 no. Paul and Peter were very similar. Look, Peter and Paul, they do the same things. It's not Paul that was the apostle to the Gentiles first. No, Peter went to Cornelius first, and then Paul followed Peter. And then later in the book of Acts, you've got Paul sacrificing in the temple. And he looks a lot like Peter, and Peter looks a lot like Paul in the book of Acts. And the writer of the book of Acts is trying to say, no, Paul and the Jerusalem community, they were all one great big happy family. We know they weren't, but that's what's happening in the teens of the second century, is these various thinkers. I hesitate to call them heretics, because I'm not sure that's the best term to use of a lot of these folks. I just think they were thinkers, and they sometimes asked really good questions, and they sometimes gave really dumb answers. But again, that they're people of their time. They're working with worldviews that we don't share. Um, I have an enormous amount of respect for Marcy, and in fact, I have often said that. Uh, the best interpreter of Paul since Marcion is Doug Campbell, maybe J. Louis Martin, but Paul's been basically misunderstood from the get-go, really from the get-go, and even in the New Testament itself. So um, we have these oral and written traditions in the second century, and it's going to be really key now as the Orthodox churches, and Orthodox bishops, as they're communicating, you'll notice they're communicating almost entirely about the problem of Gnosticism. Um, by the time we get to 180, and Irenaeus is in France, and he's writing his Against the Heretics, that great big fat 5 volume, puts you to sleep in a minute. Oh God, that thing is hard to slough through, I'll tell you what. But he is really dealing with the problem of Gnosticism and Christianity, and that was the big issue, friends. It always has been. It raises its ugly head at Nicaea. It raises its head in the fifth century in the debates in and around Christology. It raises its head in many of the medieval heretical movements in France in particular, Holland. It raises its head in Protestantism, huge, huge. Protestantism becomes the religion of salvation by knowledge and right knowledge and proper knowledge and secret knowledge in many cases. Um, that's the whole problem, by the way, with modern charismania. It's identical to the ancient Gnostic tradition of secrets. We've got secrets. You know, we have visions and we know the 10 keys and the 5 steps and the secret ladders and the doors and all that nonsense that they do. Um, Modern Christianity is not much different than second century Christianity. It's primarily Gnostic, and the Orthodox bishops were, in many cases, in the minority. This is the thesis of Walter Bauer, and it's an important thesis because Bauer argues that the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox bishops over these house churches in geographic areas, were the minority, and the majority were the heretics. Think about this. Marcion, second century, Marcion's expansion of his churches was greater than that of the Orthodox bishops. The expansion of Marcion churches was huge. And there is still a Marcionite church today that traces itself all the way back in Asia, in India, and parts of Iran, Iraq. You can find Marcionites, Marcionite churches. This is really his influence was huge. You can't just quell it. And the early bishops really struggled because again, they're having to deal with their relationship to Judaism. And remember the anti oh, I've started I'm remembering stuff I was teaching in the Philippians lecture, but I talked a lot about anti-Semitism in the ancient world. And the early second century church is having to distinguish itself from Judaism so that it doesn't suffer anti-Semitic persecution. It's also having to distinguish itself from Gnosticism on the level of theology because the Gnostics are presenting a false Christ and a false view of salvation. So there is in the second century this desperate need for an authority, and that authority is in apostolic succession. That will lead the writers to begin asking these questions I mentioned earlier about biblical literature. Now, if you want, for those of you that like reading books, Robert Grant's a historian, and in his book Heresy and Criticism, he details how you have the influence of the Greek critical thinking on the early fathers and how they appropriated that in their search for the authorities that would be used in the worship of the church and the books then that would be used. So what I want to do is share my screen with you. This share screen. Okay. Okay. This, let me minimize this, is in your it's in the group. I'm going to put you all in on Facebook. If I'm not a Facebook friend, make sure I am so that I can put you in the group. This is a collection from Josephus and the Talmud in Judaism, Marcion, the earliest manuscript we have of any New Testament list or canonical list, Melito of Sardis, Origen of Alexandria, Eusebius of Caesarea, various synods and early church fathers down. Here's the second century, year 200 Muratorian fragment, which doesn't deal with the Old Testament, but does with the New. So if you scroll down, this is the New Testament down here. Okay, so this is the Old Testament, this is the New Testament. And these are the various authorities, synods, or important canonical lists. And you will notice that there have been questions and debates about an awful lot of literature, some of it apocryphal, some of it apocryphal, some of it canonical. Okay? Even down to the time of the Reformation. You notice I mentioned Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation being tossed here. The author doesn't have Zwingli here. He would have tossed Revelation as well. But you have canon lists. And then, of course, you've got your designators here as to how to read the chart. The point is, there is no such thing as a canon of the Bible. There are canons, plural, of Holy Scripture, and there always have been. The Catholic canon has books that we don't have. The Ethiopic Bible has a book we don't have as Protestants, and so on and so forth. And my Bible, I just throw out Revelation like Luther. I'm very comfortable with that. I just don't think it belongs. So people ask me, what about Revelation? I tell them I don't give a shit. It's like, I don't care. No, I can let the Mennonites interpret that. They do a nice pacifist reading of it that I love very much, and so I'm quite content to let them write their books on it and others. Okay. Um, we are those who live and breathe this air of tradition. It's part of who we are. You've been informed by your tradition, your church tradition, your spiritual experience is part of your tradition. Your psychological makeup is part of your tradition. Your teachers are all part of your tradition. Everything you think is tradition. We don't have original thoughts, my friends. Okay. We might put this and this together originally, but we don't have original thoughts. Okay. Very important. We are those who are not trying to be original. It's the attempt to be original, to be different, to differentiate in that Girardian sense that creates the problem of heresy. I have no interest in saying, oh, the doctrine of the Trinity, well, you can throw that out. You don't need that. That makes no sense. How can 1 + 1 + 1 equal 1? We don't know. How can God be three persons? Does that mean three minds, three wills, da 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 da? Maybe we got to go all Jürgen Moltmann and talk about social community or something, when it comes to the doctrine of the Trinity. Here's the deal. It's not our place to decide what to retain or not. And that's why, even though I joke about throwing out the book of Revelation, and I do joke about it. I mean, I'm kind of serious, but not really, because it's not my place. I don't have authority to throw out a book of the Bible. I don't. I am not the church. Only the church could make that decision. And right now, the church is so fragmented, we don't even have to think that way. So we're stuck with it in that sense. When we want to think of ourselves in relation to Holy Scripture, we absolutely have to think of ourselves as those that are both captured by the regula fidei, the message about the Father and the Son. That's what it's all about. That's what worship is all about. That's what Scripture is all about. That's what the Christian life is all about. Okay. Because if we distinguish or separate them, we're going to end up essentially with a God of religion. Because Jesus alone is the one that can break through the Janist-faced God tradition. We're going to see this in the next part of our talks. Again, I'm hoping you've seen the second set of talks we did in the last seminar, because there we discussed religion and revelation and the distinction between the two, and how to see them. Okay, that is number two talk. Any thoughts or comments or anything you all want to jump in on? Correct me and whatever.
Just interest. Why would you think that Revelation is something that's a bit off?
Well, first of all, the book itself is a pastiche of about 300 allusions to all manner of Jewish tradition, not just scriptural tradition, but pseudepigraphal tradition as well, um, including Enoch all over the place. I uh, I don't know that it can be interpreted, Dusan. I think, I know I have a good friend uh, who has, has interpreted Revelation. I don't know. I just it's one of those books where you could read into it just about anything you want. About, I mean, I'm leery of the God concept in the book of Revelation. Even though I understand the whole triumph of the Lamb thing that goes on there, and how you can read the text pacifistically. I know you can, because my Mennonite friends have done it. I'm just not comfortable with it. It's one of those books that the early fathers had real trouble with. Let me put it
It,
this way.
it, it's
Revelation,
fine to be comfortable.
Revelation has no real canonical status in Orthodoxy. It might be in their Bibles, but it's never in their liturgy. You know, Luther threw it out, Zwingli threw it out, Calvin wouldn't comment on it. It wasn't accepted by the early fathers for 500 years. I mean, you find a question mark next to Revelation everywhere because of the millenarian problem, the thousand-year reign concept. That's a real issue, because it's just a real issue for the early church, because it's anti-empire, and you don't want a book that's that anti-empire, especially after Eusebius and Constantine becomes, the leading Christian. But it's never really fully accepted until about the 10th century, and even then, there are question marks around. It's been the one book of the Bible that you could say has had the most questions put to it with regard to its canonicity. That's what makes dispensationalism so stupid. They try to build their entire tradition around a disputed book, you know.
I have a question, Michael.
Hmm.
Are you able to sort of put into a nut, I suppose, how Gnosticism, how it affects our faith and how it affects the gospel? Like, what exactly is the danger? And
The danger of Gnosticism lies in its binary approach to everything. Everything is light, dark, good, evil, right, wrong. Okay, it's a binary worldview. You might want to trace its origins to Zoroaster, around the time the Yahwist and Elohist are writing their text in Persia. But you certainly see it in early Greek philosophy. Um, dualism's trying to explain it looks at life and it sees good, it sees evil, and it's trying to figure all that out. When you add that in religion into the mix, now you've got a God that has to be on since God is overall, God has to be good and God has to be evil. And Zoroaster comes along and splits them and says, nope, two gods, very distinct, but equal power, yin and yang, this kind of thing. Why is it dangerous for the Christian faith? Why is it just one? In Gnosticism, you're saved by right knowledge, by secret knowledge. You come and join our little club, and we're going to give you the secret knowledge that'll save you. Okay. Two, uh, because it is mired in a dualistic worldview, heaven and earth do not connect. You can't have an incarnation. Or as one writer put it, nobody's managed to solve the problem yet given to us by Plato and Aristotle. It's possible to bring a God down to earth, but it's not possible to take that God back up into the sphere of the spirit. Okay. Spirit and matter don't mix. There's no connection between them. The dualism itself, it reinforces patriarchy because the good is often seen as masculine, the evil is feminine. It's a reinforcement of social elitism. I mean, there's a lot of problems with it, but primarily you have to think a certain way. And there's a great book written by Philip Lee in 1987, published by Oxford University Press, called Against the Protestant Gnostics. I urge everybody to read that book. When Philip Lee wrote it, what he did was he took the founding traditions here in America, the writers of those traditions, the Puritans and the Congregationalists, the Puritans being the conservative side of the Christian tradition, the Congregationalists being the liberal side of the Christian tradition, and then went on to use these writers to show that they were arguing over a set of presuppositions, and that set of presuppositions is identical to that of ancient Gnosticism. And so he says, if Irenaeus were here today, he would write a book called Against the Protestant Gnostics rather than against, heresies. And he makes a very valid case. And when I first read that book, when it was published, I was in seminary in 1987. Sure, Against the Protestant Gnostics is the book. Philip Lee, 1L, Philip, Philip Lee. He's a Canadian Presbyterian. He's just deceased. And it's Oxford University Press, 1987. A really important book. Opened my eyes and allowed me for the first time to understand that so many of the problems I have with liberal Christianity are the same problems I have with conservative Christianity. And why was that so? Because they're both Gnostic. And the light bulbs went on and I realized, God, this is why both conservative and liberal Protestant Christianity have failed the world. The Protestantism, in my view, is at a dead end. It's a failed experiment. It's over. It's over. I don't know that we're at the end of Christianity. I don't know that. I don't think so. I think that the intellectual tradition of Christianity still has a very important role to play in the world, especially the West. But we have got to get away from you have to have the right knowledge. You have to think the way we think in order to be saved. It's not knowledge that saves us, it's trust. We are saved because we trust that the Father has revealed himself in the Son. We are saved because we trust that the Father says we are loved, we are loved. We trust that the Father didn't spare his own Son, but allowed us to even kill his own Son in order to demonstrate the extent of his love and forgiveness. This is the good news. We trust that message. And it's not that we know all the doctrine correct or anything. I mean, I would be the last person that would want to say I have correct doctrine. I really don't even like doctrine. I understand its role. I know its place. I can do systematic theology, but I'm not sure that doctrine is the best way to represent the gospel. I think since the 1980s, and again, this is I've been influenced. I was in seminary in the 80s, and this is when narrative theology was developing. Stan Hauerwas and others, and Girard, and they were beginning to see the importance of narrative. I think narrative is very important rather than doctrine. The Bible is a story. It's meant to be told as a story. Schwager, in his book, Jesus and the Drama of Salvation, makes that same claim. Um, we need to understand the story. And this is when we get to part 4 here. And I've already talked about the story. The story of the Bible is really about the violence that we've done to God and still do, and still do. Um, the violence we've done intellectually, spiritually, and now for the first time again since World War II, when the human species began to jump on the victimhood train, where everybody's a victim now. First the Jews, then this group, no, 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 until now everybody's a victim. Nietzsche prophesied this 140 years ago. Um, we are stuck, uh, and the only way out is to be able to um, to live in such a way that people see that we do trust, and that means circumstances are not a barometer of the Father's love like the conservatives want, because they have very transactional models of God and the relationship of God to humanity. Um, But circumstances are not a barometer of the Father's love for us if we're broke, poor, and marginalized and everything else. You know, Circumstances are circumstances. Life is life. I didn't choose to be born a white male in America. I could have been born somewhere else at some other time. I just happen to be in this body inhabiting this space at this time. And so I have to do the best with it what I can. And part of what I have to do is I have to learn not to piss and moan about everything that goes on in my life. That's been my challenge. My challenge has been to learn to rejoice in everything. I'm 68 years old. It's taken me a lifetime to learn these things. Um, the spiritual journey, the intellectual journey, the psychological journey, they're all intertwined, and they're all very, very beautiful, and they're all very, very hard. Growing up is hard. So,
Isn't that what you've just said? I think I just recently read if you've read it, The Abandonment of Divine Providence
and I
by
haven't. Who's about
no
who?
uh, D. Just a minute here. It's a 14th or 15th century monk. Just a minute, I've just got to grab his name.
The Abandonment of Divine Providence. How can
Yeah.
I not have heard of that or read it? And if it's a monk, I mean, I love the monks. I got a ton of their stuff.
Jean-Pierre de Caussade.
No, don't know that text. Tell me
Okay.
about it.
Well, I'm just starting to read it. It's in a
Okay.
book club I'm in.
Okay.
And so I just started, but he was actually almost saying what you're saying, what you've just said.
You're going to need to text me that reference. Woohoo!
Okay. Take a picture and send you some.
Some 14-year-old guy in a candlelit, dank monastic cell thought these thoughts before me. That's great. I told you there's no original thinking. No original. We just keep repeating the same things.
Yeah, 1751. He lived in the
Oh,
18th century. Yeah,
okay,
sorry.
17.
Yeah.
Okay. That's different than a 14th century monk. So we're dealing with an Enlightenment monk, and we don't know what order he's from, do we?
Pardon me.
Does it
The
tell you
Society of Jesus in France in the 18th century.
but what order is he with?
Oh, I'm not
Okay,
sure.
all right, all right, all right. That's okay. That's okay. At that point, the Jesuits are most interesting. But anyway, okay. So anyway, yeah. Any other thoughts anybody has?
Michael, isn't I'm interested in your the it's not knowledge that saves us, but trust. And um I can remember at the Riverside meeting of Cover, Colloquium on Violence and Religion, there was this guest who accused Girard himself of being a Gnostic.
Right, I remember that. I was a
Yeah, yeah. So
I stood up and
got.
corrected Renee at that meeting about his interpretation of the artwork in Catahoyuk.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
but go ahead.
yeah, because he shook people up by saying,
It was penises.
okay, that part.
Oh, Renee, it's out. Listen out.
Um, isn't trust though? I mean, if we're in a relationship with someone and we trust them, and I don't mean to be splitting hairs, but isn't it because we know the person, we are acquainted with the person, we have certain beliefs about the person that are reassuring, that are a foundation for our behavior and our engagement with the person. Um, and isn't that a kind of knowledge? Is it
That's
more
what,
that
that's
the
what,
knowledge
that's,
shouldn't be intellectual knowledge, but kind of
okay.
practical knowledge? Or can you
So,
expand
yeah.
on that?
Okay. So, yeah. So, first of all, in the discipleship group, in the pinned post are all the first 9-month lectures I did on unsystematic theology. And I started off my unsystematic theology with 4 lectures on trust. Okay.
Oh, okay.
And the difference between trust and belief or faith, fides, and how I used Teresa Morgan's great book on Roman faith and Christian faith to argue that fides in the West, the Latin West, fides tends to be an intellectual operation. I believe in, whereas trust is a relational. Pistis
Okay.
is relational, and then I went on to distinguish how with fides you have contracts that are transactional, whereas with pistis you have covenants. Then I talked about the breakdown of trust in another lecture and what happens intellectually, psychologically, socially. But the importance of trust in the gospel message is that there's this announcement from heaven, from the ultimate reality, and that says, I love you. I care about you. You matter, and the person next to you matters. I mean, that's the message.
Mhm.
It's that simple. And then the second part of the message is follow me as you see myself manifested in my son Jesus. There's the call to discipleship. And that's what gives us then the concrete parameters for how to relate to each other and why we forgive each other, why we love each other, why we care for each other, why we nurture each other, why we don't judge each other, why we don't condemn each other. We have very concrete parameters there in discipleship. And that's why you can't separate kerygma from didache, preaching from discipleship, the message, the gospel message from living it. The message is lived, that's trust.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's non-binary, it's integral.
Mhm.
Ken Wilberish.
Okay. Ken Wilber.
Ish.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, again, that's right, Lenny. Against the Protestant Gnostics, and you should be able to find that on Amazon used cheap. That book. In fact, what I'll do is I'll go when I put you each in the Facebook group. You'll be in the Facebook group called Seminar Number 3, whatever the title is. I have a PDF copy of that. I'll just put in the group, and that way you don't have to go buy it, and unless you want to have a hardcover to mark up, which is the love of my. I can't. I have a hard time reading PDFs, man. I'll tell you what. Give me a physical book anytime. Oof. You know, I don't know. Reading on a Kindle's like kissing a mannequin. It just isn't the same.
I like reading on my iPad, though. I've got a 13-inch screen. It's pretty good.
Oh, that'll work. Sharon, or Gayla, we need the name of the book. I'm sorry, Sharon, we need the name of the book. If you could throw it in the chat for us, and the name of the monk. We would love to. A number of us are just champing to go read that. That could be very fun. Is any of this making sense to anybody? What I'm trying to do, where I'm going?
Yes.
Right. When we come back from our little lunch break, bring a Bible, I don't care about the translation. Okay. All translators are traitors. There's a Latin phrase because the word translator and traitor in Latin is almost identical. And so the translators, I mean, God, I am, yes, as I'm translating Philippians for you guys, I am really aware that, I am reading stuff into the text. I'm pretending that I'm actually exegeting this text, but oh God, I am so aware that I'm reading my own shit into it. Ah! So, yeah.
Can I just mention, uh, you might want to stop recording or something, I don't know. That book that you recommended,
Yeah.
found it really fascinating. More reasons than one, but I really think, as you said, it's just brilliant way of understanding Galatians. But from where I'm standing, I can see gaps in his understanding. So maybe one day we'll talk about this couple of little
Sure.
gaps.
Sure.
Because to me, when I just wrote 20 posts on Facebook on Book of Galatians. I started in October and I kept on writing them until I went through it. And some of the stuff that he wrote, which you just mentioned, this duality world, and in Christ, we are no longer in a dual world. We are now in the kingdom of God, which there is no duality in there. So in those, that it's just brilliant in the way he actually explained it so beautifully. That is these little gaps. For example, when people mention the law, which one? Is it law of mathematics or physics or chemistry of big force, small force, electric magnetism?
Wait. When people mention the law, are we talking about Christians having a discourse that's theological?
No, that's what I'm saying. So
They're almost always mentioning Torah. That would be Torah. I would obviously assume the average Christian has never given any thought to the law of thermodynamics or anything else. When they talk about the law, they mean the
I
Torah.
think this is where in the book of Galatians, I think he makes a distinction. Anyway, it's a
Paul
topic
does?
for another time.
Well, if he does, it's because he's going to critique the stoicheia kosmou, the concept of immutable philosophical theological laws that we have that run the universe. But yeah, okay, we could definitely talk about that. Let's take a little break. I've got 12:30. How's 20 minutes? Was 20 minutes enough for you guys
Yeah,
to eat,
for me,
do your stuffs? Okay. 10 to 1 my time, Central Time. So 10 minutes to the hour, wherever you're at, we'll rejoin. Make sure you have a Bible with you. We're going to have some fun.